there are multiple storylines that all feed into this idea.
The town doesn't exist at the beginning of this movie. It's an idea, you could say, and it's being advertised, which is drawing people to it.
This seems to be maybe the crux of why Costner made this film. You know, it's set during Civil War. What created this nation and the disunity, but also the unity of that moment in time, and how important it is to look at the development of where we've come from and what made us who we are.
Yeah.
And remember that right now when we are so divided today.
Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew.
Hello?
Hey guys.
Right here at the beginning, I want to remind you to be sure to like and subscribe and leave us some comments. Help us grow this podcast, spread it out to more people.
Yep. Leave a review.
Yep. Our topic for today is Horizon, an American Saga, Chapter 1, which is Kevin Costner's new film. We all went to go see it yesterday, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Andrew, I think you led the charge for us to watch this. Do you want to take us off?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Westerns, Western literature and film. My favorite two movies from Kevin Costner are Open Range and, of course, Dances with Wolves.
Personally, I like Robin Hood Men and Thieves, but okay.
Okay. And actually something worth mentioning, Robin Hood Men and Thieves later. I'll get to that later. But huge fan of the West, huge fan of Westerns. I think they're instrumental in telling the story of what this country was made for and where we've been and where we're going. And I was just really excited for what Kevin Costner had in mind. I know that critics have been concerned about it being a flop.
Yeah, this was a movie he wanted to make, and that's the point.
Right.
He wanted to make this movie, thought people should see this movie. It's not about how much money it makes. But of course, it needs to make money.
Right. But he did mention in another interview, Robin Hood Men in Tights didn't do great out the gate.
Yeah, I should clarify. I said Men in Tights. It's Robin Hood Prince of Thieves is his movie. Men in Tights is the spoof movie.
Okay. Well, anyway, I think he was referencing his own movie.
Prince of Thieves, yeah.
Of course. Anyway. So yeah, that's why we went to see it, because I think that the American Western should be popular.
And it historically has been incredibly popular.
Yeah. Although right now it seems to be less so.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's a genre that ebbs and flows, and right now it's kind of on an ebb.
Yeah.
Sort of. But if you look at the success of like Yellowstone, which is you could call a modern day Western, and then the spinoffs from that, there's still a pretty hungry appetite for at least the American West, as far as the classic, both the scenery, I think, which draws people,
The feel,
the wildness, I think, is also attractive.
I think Costner saw that this was his opportunity to make this film, because it is one that he has wanted to make for many decades.
Yeah, and he's fought to try to make it.
Right. And he's spent a bunch of his own money to make this happen. But mentioning Yellowstone, Thomas, I think he tried to use that as a launch pad to make this successful. So
let's talk about the actual movie.
Okay.
So the movie opens with these surveyors in pretty much the middle of nowhere, surveying. So they've got their little tripods and their sticks they're setting up, and I don't exactly know why surveyors do the things they do, but they're tying strings, and mapping out how many acres they've got and all that stuff. And they're being watched by a couple of Indian kids, and then some more Indians show up, Apaches. And then it goes through, there's a lot of this movie. It's a big movie. We're not going to synopsize the whole thing, but the start of it is that the Indians come and attack. They kill the 3 surveyors. This priest comes by, he buries them, and then more people show up and they decide to build there anyway.
Yep.
And then history repeats itself, and they get attacked, and there's a big battle scene where the Apaches attack this town of maybe 200 people by that time. And then we follow different people from that point on. The U.S. military comes in the next day to kind of aid the town, and we kind of follow a mother and her daughter, the Kittredges, who survive. And there's a lot of this movie. But that's kind of the beginning of it.
Sure. Yeah, there are multiple storylines that all feed into this idea. And the idea is Horizon, which is
The name of the town.
The name of the town, but it is kind of the symbol of the pioneer spirit. And I wouldn't say that it follows like your normal Western where you have just a protagonist and a storyline. I mean, it's really broad, just like you said, Sterling. And one thing I really appreciated about the breadth is showing the different people groups.
Yeah.
Particularly Native Americans, Indians, Chinese, Americans, Irishmen, and African.
Yeah. Even of the Americans, the difference between the kind of hardened people who've been out West and know what it's like and know what you need to do to survive, and some of the more privileged kind of effete, idiot people who don't know anything and are completely helpless.
Right.
Yeah. And I'll just kind of finish the synopsis portion of this. There's kind of three main storylines after the bit I've laid out. There's these people called the Sykes family, who we follow some of their history. They're either, the law in their area or they're outlaws. It's not really clear. And that's, I think, on purpose. And this guy named Hayes, who is Kevin Costner. And there's a bunch of story there involving trying to keep this
revenge, I think, is a major theme.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the main point of that plot. And Sykes kind of falling in love, or not so much falling in love, kind of falling in with this prostitute named Marigold. And
you mean Hayes?
Hayes, yeah, not Sykes.
Costner's character.
Yeah.
Costner's character. That's one of the three kind of main plot lines. There's also the wagon train, that shows up in the second half of the movie as people are traveling on the wagon train to Horizon, and some of the things that go on when you're traveling in a wagon train. And then there's what I'll call the Indians and the Indian hunters, which is both the Apaches and the people who, after that big attack, set out to go hunt down the people who attacked them. And then I guess there's actually four. There's also the town of Horizon and the military, the U.S. Union military, because this is set in 1863.
Yeah. I think the name of the town is kind of thematic for, I think, what's going to be this whole saga. The town doesn't exist at the beginning of this movie. It's an idea, you could say, and it's being advertised, which is drawing people to it. But it hasn't been built.
Yeah, but there's artwork of it.
There's artwork of it, but it doesn't exist except in the minds of those who are advertising it and those who dream about this, you could say, new place of freedom. I think that's kind of like, I think that theme was kind of repeated throughout. And it also does point to different motivations for this one location of freedom. They're setting it up, obviously, I think he's setting it up so that some of the characters they're all kind of moving there for different reasons or fleeing something to what Horizon's going to be. But the fact of the matter is, Horizon is also a place of death. Yeah.
As we are shown several times in the very 45 minutes.
It's not going to be something once you're arrived, you're arrived. And I think that is kind of insightful on Costner's part in regards to the nature of the United States.
Yeah. Because that's been the history over time, many times. Yeah. Jamestown, when they arrived, almost everyone died. Mayflower, almost everyone died. And it took a lot of time and a lot of death before we started getting actual developed cities or anything like civilization.
Well, there's also
Western civilization.
There's also the thing of you have to fight to preserve it. Sure. You can't just get it and have it.
Yeah.
It's something that has to be fought for and fought to preserve. And he intentionally places this movie in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War.
Yeah.
What's interesting is there's very few references to that. You'd tend to think that there's going to be elements of like different people going, what are you, for the Union or for the Confederacy? But there's none of that.
Because you're out West.
Because you're out West.
The point is, how do I survive?
Yeah. The point is you're valuable not based upon, what you look like, but how competent you are.
Yeah.
If you're competent to help out, you're going to be accepted. If you're not, you're just going to be left to kind of die.
And even if you're competent, you can still die. And that's shown many times over.
Yeah.
And to your point about the idea of time and resources and people having to come and build and die and build and die, that's specifically referenced in the movie with the colonel over the outpost, the Union Fort outpost.
Yeah, Colonel Houghton is his name.
And he mentions, and paraphrase, it is just our job to allow time to do what it has always done. And they will continue to come until and continue to die until they have built something.
Yeah. And he's saying that to Lieutenant Trent, who's kind of one of the main characters. There's not one main character. There's a few. And when he arrives at Horizon after the Apache attack, he gives this big speech about, what are you doing here? You can't stay here. You can't defend yourselves here. You're going to die here. And, of course, they just lived through an Apache attack and they were already, starting to rebuild. So it's like, you think a speech, and that's what Houghton says, you think a speech is going to dissuade them after they survive an Apache attack. And yeah, as you said, it's just this kind of dream of the West is so powerful that the reality can't match up to it.
Right.
Or can it?
Or can it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an open-ended question. I think he intentionally plays into that. There's definitely a creation aspect, but there's also the death plays into that. I think the death is both of those trying to build something new, but also of those who are losing something, which is the natives, the Indians. They're losing their way of life.
Yeah.
They can see it coming. Some are going to fight to the death to try to stop it.
Yeah, and the one who leads that is Pionsene, that's his name.
But it's the inevitability of the future. I mean, it's almost like you can't stop it. And I think that's like what you're saying with the Colonel
Houghton. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. His insight is recognizing, I think, before the lieutenant even understood it, what the West means as a concept, not just as a place.
Yeah. And you kind of have a mirror of that scene between the colonel and the lieutenant with Pionsene and I think it's his father who leads the tribe of that area.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was his father.
Yeah. And the father is formerly a war chief, but now saying, if we don't attack them, they won't attack us. We can live in peace. We live up here in the mountains. Let's just not bother them. And sure, we can't hunt in that valley where Horizon is anymore, but there's other places to hunt. We have plenty to eat. We're not starving. And Pionsene is like, no, this is an existential threat to our way of life. And
he's right.
He's right.
Yeah.
And it's, the inverse is Trent saying, these people are all going to die, but at the same time, they're going to triumph even through their death in conquering the West. And I say they are going to because we know they did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we're looking at it from, 150 years later.
Yeah.
But the theme of change is constant. The theme of power struggles, a divided nation is clearly also a theme that we can readily recognize today. I think even the question of at the time, I appreciate how Costner did this because Costner is telling you a story and he avoids any kind of preachiness or what I have come to expect from a lot of more modern kind of Westerns is the noble savage and the villainous white man. I've gotten so tired of that trope because it's never been fully true. It never has been fully true. It's been one that's been, popularized probably since the 60s at least. And while there were atrocities committed against the natives by white men or by the government for sure, it wasn't always one way. And,
no, the atrocities went both ways, absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's kind of one of those things where he allows for the nuance of understanding, I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to tell a story that's going to have varying degrees of humanity, and it's not going to be based on what they look like. It's going to be based upon how they behave. And there are some people who you could argue that some of the most impressive figures or the ones you are most attracted to as good people, like the lieutenant, even the soldiers aren't depicted as a bunch of bloodthirsty guys who just want to kill Indians.
No. Yeah. They're boys. Yeah. Essentially.
Yeah. They're doing their job and they've been well trained and they seem to have good hearts. They don't seem to have this kind of bloodlust to them.
And sorry, finish your point. Yeah. I have a note.
And if you look at we were just mentioning the head Indian chief who is advising and recognizing that change is inevitable. They can't defeat this new group. Let's learn to get along with him rather than try to kill him. Mm-hmm. And he's an honorable man, and you can recognize that and say, these are the types of, there's a reason these were the leaders.
Yeah.
And I guess the hope is ultimately these are the people who prevail versus those who are just like want to go pick fights and want to go get revenge and get even.
Yeah.
And we have all these elements being presented. And even within that, I thought one of the most interesting things was there's a group that's bent on revenge after the horizon's been raided and killed.
Yeah, a group of white men. Yeah.
Group of white men who want to go basically and hire out help to be basically scalp hunters, Indian hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And even within that group, the one guy who initially is like, I'm going to do this because I got to basically seek revenge. You see later on, even he is like, no, we're only going after those Indians who are guilty of this. I'm not going to just go kill anybody.
That guy is Elias Janney. And the other one who's kind of his protege is the kid who escapes the attack on Horizon and warns the military, Russell Gans. And then, in that group, you have the other side of the coin, a guy who, according to IMDb, doesn't have a real name. It's just Tracker. I don't know if that's a nickname or if that's just his job, and that's what they wrote down.
Yeah.
And he's just any dead Indian is a good Indian.
He's
basically.
A villain character for sure. Yeah. I mean, there are definite villain characters for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's definite villain characters from every group.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And definite good characters from every group. And it really focuses on the content of your character and your ability as an individual, meritocracy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Going back to my note, just before I forget it, you were mentioning the guys in the military, the Union soldiers. There's a great scene. There's a lot of great scenes in this movie, and I'll just say I think a lot of the tone is it's quick enough between scenes that you don't get bored. There's not any of that long drawn out see how much they're suffering stuff. It moves on to the next thing and shows you something interesting. So that's part of why I enjoyed it, because I'm never bored.
Yeah.
But there's a great scene where the Union soldiers show up and they find the Kittredge women who they spent overnight in a tunnel that had collapsed. They dug a breathing hole. And the Union soldiers find them, and there's a great scene of the Union soldiers digging up the tunnel and using their body, and it's like just something you don't think about today. Because today, if you need to dig a hole, you go get some power tools, whatever you need, and it's, relatively easy. Back then, the only power tools were the human body or horses or whatever.
United States Army.
And watching them do that, it's just like bam, bam, bam. They're just throwing the dirt out of there. But then the other point you were making about there's good guys and there's bad guys. Even in kind of the villain group, I would say the Sykes family.
Yeah. There's
two brothers who you really kind of follow from the Sykes family. One of them is Junior. One of them is Ben. Junior is the older brother, and he's taller. And Ben is kind of a psycho and is just ready to kill people. And Junior is not a good guy, but he also doesn't want any more bloodshed than there has to be. And so part of the interesting thing is he's a villain, yes, but he's also reining in the even more horrible aspects of his younger brother.
He's a level-headed individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciated the pacing of this film.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a pacing that is common for today, though, because today people want quicker hits, quicker, faster, quicker. It seems like and there's definitely, I think Costner leans into let the story tell itself and let the scenes, although he doesn't do as many epic scenes as like Dances with Wolves. Dances with Wolves, you have those big, massive, open range kind of vistas and stuff like that. You get less of that in this. He doesn't.
There's still a lot of it.
It's there, but it doesn't have the film score that who was it? Barry was it? I can't remember who did the film score for Dances with Wolves. John Barry. It doesn't.
Yes, John Barry.
It doesn't have that level of film score. It's good, but it's not that level.
I'll just on the music. I take note of music in movies because I feel like it's kind of gone downhill in the past few decades. I thought this was a pretty good score, especially for 2024.
It's decent. It's just not something that I don't predict this is going to be one that we're going to stick in your head and you remember.
At least so far that it hasn't delivered that. Yeah.
But what I did appreciate is how he doesn't get overly dramatic or overly emotional, which I think is perfect to me, that was one of the best things about this, because that is the West. the West, you have to be of tough nature and tough character because only the tough survived it. Especially in this scenario, and you can't let your emotions control you or you're dead.
Yeah.
And I think that he kind of recognizes that, and it didn't matter the sex of the individual. What mattered was, can you move on even after such great tragedies? You have to pick it up and keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I felt like not only was that in the dramatic scenes where there's the attacks and the murders and everything like that, but it was just like in everyday pacing of everything. There was this sense of like, to live, you got to keep moving.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes was from the Master Sergeant after the Apache raid in the morning, and they're cleaning up, and the young boy who you mentioned earlier, Sterling, Russell, is standing there. He says, "Well, son, it looks like your parents have gone on to their reward and left us to do the work.
Yeah,
I'll give you a minute, and then we'll decide what to do." And that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, and he does take a minute, and he cries a little bit, and then it's back to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that same note, the scene where the Kittredge women are in the tunnel, finding it has collapsed, the daughter starts to panic, and the mom keeps saying, "You have to trust me. You have to trust me. You can't be emotional because we're both going to suffocate and die here if you are." And because they keep their emotions in check, they survive.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, even those who did keep their emotions in check don't, like you said, doesn't mean you're going to survive.
It doesn't mean necessarily, but you won't survive if you can't.
It just brought to my mind, this conversation brought to my mind that a quick scene from the movie Predator where they're attacking the outpost early in the movie. And I think it's Jesse Ventura. And one of the characters goes, "You've been hit, you're bleeding." He's like, "I don't have time to bleed."
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the attitude of this movie for sure.
That was just, that's it.
One thing I really appreciated about this movie is how wide a view of the West it gives you, of the Old West. It gives you Horizon, which is in southern Arizona. It gives you
northern Arizona, isn't it?
Southern.
It's
southern
supposed to be southern
Arizona. Yeah.
Okay, that's surprising.
At least the San Pedro Valley, which is where it's supposed to be in southern Arizona.
It looks like it. I don't know if it was filmed there, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, lots of the shots were clearly out west, may not have been exactly where they said it was.
A lot of this was filmed in Utah, actually.
Okay. Well, but every landscape looks, you're like, yep, that's the American West. That's the only place it could be. But it gives you that, southern Arizona. It gives you some of the wagon train, which is presumably in Kansas or Oklahoma or something. Could be Texas.
I think they said Kansas at one point in the movie.
Did they? Okay.
I think they said southwestern Kansas.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
It gives you Wyoming, in a mining town in Wyoming, and you get to see what a small mining town would have looked like. And then you get a little bit farther north, which is presumably fur trappers or furriers or something in Montana.
Yeah, that's the impression at least they give you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it gives you the landscapes. It gives you kind of the differences between these places. It really is. It's a wide movie. It shows you a lot.
Yeah. And I think that lends itself to something you said earlier, Thomas, before we began, with the whole concept of fences make good neighbors / wide spaces make good neighbors.
Yeah.
And I was reading a quote from Larry McMurtry, who is the author of Lonesome Dove, among many other prolific Western novels. And he was asked about Texas because he hails from Texas. And he said that just Texas itself has 5 different cultures, some of which include like the Gulf or the Midwest or the Panhandle or the border, etc.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really cool, to your point, Sterling, of seeing all these different geographical locations, but then also within each location showing the different cultures that were developing in those spots.
Right. Yeah.
And I think to that point, at the same time, and this seems to be maybe the crux of why Costner made this film. You know, it's set during the Civil War, and what created this nation and the disunity, but also the unity of that moment in time, and how important it is to look at the development of where we've come from and what made us who we are.
Yeah.
And remember that right now when we are so divided today.
Yeah. The whole movie you're reminded they had to fight for the West, for the Old West. They had to fight for what they had. They had to fight for survival.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in a time in America where we're going to have to fight for the continuation of what we have had or not. And we are, I think all three of us are descendants from people who made those kind of fights for those kinds of things.
Yep.
And we have it in us to do that if we can rise to the challenge. And
I mean, I think we are doing it. And I think that there is, I mean, we call it the culture war. And for good reason. It is a clashing of cultures.
Yeah.
In the same sense, this movie depicts a clashing of cultures.
Yeah.
And it's not just clashing of cultures between white men, Indian.
Yeah.
That is the bigger one. But there's a clashing of cultures within all these different groups as these people are coming from a bunch of different backgrounds and they're coming to this one ideal or this one town horizon, right? And that's creating conflict.
Yeah.
But what is it that you can coalesce around and agree to and unify behind versus fight and divide over? That's really what's going to make or break you or the ultimate idea. And I think in that sense, that's the culture where we're in. What is our ultimate value that we're fighting to keep? And who is on the right side of this? I mean, what will happen if one side wins versus the other side wins in the sense of, the culture.
Yeah. I think on that note, in the movie, at least, while, certainly we as Christians can argue there is a right side to the conflicts in the movies, in this movie, it's not necessarily true that when two sides meet, one of the sides is wrong. One of them might be more right, but the other isn't necessarily wrong. Like the Apaches aren't wrong in their analysis of the situation. And that was just an interesting thing to me, that it's not black and white. It's not clear cut.
It's almost never that black and white. There's always nuance in the equation. It's in one sense, it behooves people to get behind one thing to make it more seemingly black and white. Right? We know this. I mean, politicians have made a long time career out of trying to boil things down to black and white issues so that people will side with them or oppose the other side. When we know in reality, it's never that black and white. There's a lot of nuance involved.
Yeah, that is true. So this is just a question I had. The Indians in the movie, the Apaches, refer to the settlers as white eyes. Do either of y'all know the origin of that term? I've never heard it before.
No, I don't. And there was some curious language in the movie that I wasn't certain would have been the lingo at the time that it's depicting. Like you're saying, white eyes might have been a term that the Apaches used, maybe. The other term was indigenous. I found it a little surprising.
They said indigenous and aboriginal.
Right.
And I'm like, I think they would have just called them Indians, but
I found that a little curious, but I wasn't sure.
Wasn't the term aboriginal used by the British adventure tourist types?
I think you're right.
Yeah. So there was this couple on the wagon train, and they actually remind me of some characters in McMurtry books and Barry Bender family that travels from Europe, England. I think he's Duke, and his daughter is a Duchess, and they come to America for this huge hunting expedition, and they have these high expectations to be taken care of, and they're these proper British people. And they remind me very much of those kind of characters.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wonder if Costner, I'm sure he's read McMurtry.
Surely. I mean, if he's this into Westerns.
And there are a few other areas where, in particular, Cormac McCarthy, I felt like maybe was referenced. I would love to ask Kevin Costner if some of these scenes were references to, or at least ideas from great American Western novels.
Yeah.
But anyway, to the point about these well-to-do people, I think that maybe the term indigenous in that case would have been used properly from a British standpoint.
You mean aboriginal?
Or aboriginal, yeah.
Yeah.
It was the lieutenant who was using the term indigenous.
Okay. And I don't know that was...
Yeah, it was, I wondered about it. I don't know that it's wrong, but it was interesting.
I'm just thinking, obviously it's a popular term in modern parlance.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if that word was used ever back then. And if it was the case, was it considered more of a proper way of referring than Indian?
Yeah.
But they use all three terms. So it's kind of like real in that sense. If it was a genuine word that was in use at the time, then sure.
Yeah.
It just seemed a little strange because I haven't, and this is the folklore of American Westerns, especially going back. I don't recall ever hearing, like John Wayne or anybody ever referred to Indians like the Indigenous.
Right.
But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he did.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Andrew, speaking of, these terms that we didn't quite recognize, there were a few, you were noticing some of the oddities about the guns, right? In the movie.
Yeah. So there's always nitpicks, especially when it comes to a Hollywood film from a historian standpoint, historic accuracy. The weapons that were used, they made a good stab at it, I would say, to be appropriate for 1863.
It wasn't like blaringly wrong.
Yeah, although I would argue that the prolific availability of cartridge type weapons, particularly the revolvers, the cartridge conversion revolvers, didn't seem appropriate for 1863.
Yeah, pretty much anytime we see anyone load a weapon, they seem to be using cartridges.
Yeah, I would have expected at that time to see a lot more muzzleloader type stuff. A lot more shotguns.
Especially amongst a lot of these folks some of them were well off, but a lot of them aren't.
Yeah, they're just pioneer civilians.
And you're in the West, you're going to be farthest away from cutting edge technology, not closest.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the middle of the war. So all of those resources are
going to go to the military.
Into the military conflict. Yeah. So I did question some of that. They did make an attempt, for example, the revolvers tended to be of the open top variety, which would have been common for example, the 1851 Colt Navy be an open top 36 caliber muzzleloader revolver, prolific in that time period, very popular even up into the 70s. But after the war, they would have been converted into the cartridge types.
Okay.
So yeah, that was a little bit of a nitpick for me. Costner at one point has what I believe is an 1863 Henry repeating rifle.
Well, that's in the trailer sequence at the end of the movie,
right,
which I think is mostly scenes we're going to see in chapter 2 or maybe even chapter 3.
And that may signal future.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, fine.
Yeah.
I also saw a ton of examples of Sharp's carbines, which I don't think would have necessarily been available especially to civilians during that time period. I mean, I'm not a bona fide historian or anything, but
right. But this is one of your special interests.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to hear that. Where would you, if you're rating the historical accuracy of what you saw and what you noticed, where would you put it out of, what do we usually do for the movie ratings?
10 scale.
10 scale. Where would you put it? 10 being, it was totally accurate. There was nothing wrong. And
6.
1 being a 6. Okay.
Yeah, I put it at a 6. I will say there was one example I thought was particularly good.
Okay.
One of the Sykes brothers, that was their name, right?
Yeah, Sykes.
The older brother was wearing a frock coat, which was an 1860s unique kind of design that didn't really appear later on. It went out of style into the 70s and 80s.
Okay, so that was pretty localized in time.
For being Civil War era, that was proper. Okay. I also noticed a lot of the shirts were baggier, which was proper for that time period. So they made a good attempt at it. It wasn't all bad, but it was definitely Hollywood.
Yeah. Well, some of that you got to excuse because of a rule of cool. You know, you want it during the Civil War. You also want weapons that aren't boring to watch.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. Laying behind an embankment trying to
exactly
load a double barrel shotgun with a ramrod.
Yeah. So on the note of kind of inaccuracies, how do we feel it did on the cultural stuff? Were the attitudes, were the values on display, do we feel accurate? I didn't notice anything where I was like, that's not how they would have behaved back then.
Yeah, I feel that I wasn't thinking that. I didn't have that thought in my mind, which I have with other stuff where
that's all three of us noticed that stuff and are bothered by it.
And I wasn't, I felt that most of the dialogue, most of the kind of decision making of the characters, for the most part, what would have been something that you could imagine was kind of the way the time period in which it happens would have would have been plausible.
Mm-hmm.
The language, like I pointed to some of the words, I'm like, would they have been using those words? I don't know. I do have a nitpick. This is just me personally because I'm a 4th generation Montanan, but Montana accent is not a Southern accent.
Yeah.
It's just not. And
Tell him, Thomas.
every time it seems like they're trying to present in Westerns often, but in movies, they're trying to show somebody who's from the West, especially someone like Northwest, like Montana or something. They give them a Southern accent. And I'm sorry, that's not what we sound like up there. So anyway.
Do they sound like you right now?
I don't really have a great Montana accent either. I've lived too many different places throughout my life.
Gotcha.
But there is a distinct Montana accent. It's a more of a subtle accent, but it exists, and it sounds nothing like a Southern accent. I guess that's the biggest thing. Don't make them sound like Southerners.
Yeah. All right.
I'll say,
like kind of like, backwoods, earthy redneck. It's like it's this whole persona that this is the language these types of people speak. And it's like, no, it isn't.
I didn't notice the accents too much, but are you referring to the Sykes brothers or just the mom when you mention the accents?
I would say all of them.
All of them sounded Southern to you?
No, they didn't all sound Southern, but there was definitely more of this kind of Southern drawl element that is just does not exist in the West Montana accent. It's not that.
Okay. All right.
I particularly took offense by the taking of the Lord's name in vain. Costner seems to like doing that.
Yeah. In his opening scene, it's like half of the words he says are the Lord's name.
It is a rated R film, so to be expected stuff like that, unfortunately. But I don't know, Sterling, you and I were discussing this before we began, whether or not that would have been commonplace in the West. Certainly, if it was common, it probably would have been in the West. But it seems to me that more people were likely religious during that time period and had more of a reverence for God. And I don't know that would have been so common.
Yeah. My only note on that is Hayes' character, or Hayes, who is Kevin Costner's character, is very mysterious. We know absolutely nothing about him before he shows up in the movie. You only know what you see on screen about him, and that's it.
Right.
So he could have a very, rough past, and it would make more sense for him to use language like that. We just don't know.
To be fair, compared to the Eastern America, we know that America's birth was religious. I mean, the Puritans they were Puritans, but the Pilgrims expressly came to the New World because they wanted to freely practice their religion.
And then pretty much every new colony was established because the colony next to them had the wrong religious laws.
Yeah, but America was very much a religious place from its birth.
Yeah.
As we move west and we're getting into more the Wild West, there would have been a much more of a secularistic kind of attitude, I think. The whole Wild West was like lawless. That was part of the idea. And that lawlessness isn't just in behavior necessarily, but I think also in belief. I think there would have been, to your point, there were definitely religious folks. Obviously, Utah is formed by a bunch of religious folks, the Mormons. But you also have those who are just rebels. I don't know how to say it. So they may have been rebellious in their language, their behavior. I mean, we do know that brothels and stuff were commonplace in a lot of these Western towns.
Yeah.
This is not new. And so that there would have been prostitutes hanging out and stuff like that. Yeah. That they followed the railroad buildings or that they followed the miners. Yeah. So it's kind of a mix of, I think in some areas that were maybe more agrarian, stable, that tends to be your more conservative groups.
And we didn't really see any
and
of
more
that in the
religious
movie.
groups. Right. We're not really shown that as much. So I do kind of agree. I think that the language itself, would it have been as we heard it as it was presented? Is that accurate? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, sorry to cut you off. I'm going to ask one final question, then we should probably wrap up.
Okay.
We give our rating of it.
Well, that after this question, I will give our rating. We kind of just covered this, but just to make it explicit, was this movie woke?
No.
No. I don't think you could say at all.
Maybe that's why I liked it.
Yeah.
Well, I think Costner wanted to tell a story, and he knew if he's going to tell a story fairly, it can't be woke.
Yeah, because people were not woke in 1863. No. They just weren't.
No.
So no, there's no wokeness in this movie. There is some objectionable stuff, some violence, some nudity, but it's not woke. It's for sure not woke. And all right, that leads us to the last thing, which is our ratings out of 10. So I don't know who wants to start. Andrew, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'd put it at a 7 out of 10.
7 out of 10.
It was really good. I quite enjoyed it. Unfortunately, the critics have been very unkind. Mm-hmm. The only reason I won't necessarily rate it higher is just because I am just a stickler for when it comes to historical accuracy. Mm-hmm. I also concede that it's never going to be right.
It's never going to be perfect.
So that's okay. I can live with that. Yeah. But, in some ways it was a little bit slow. I did like that it was slow, but at times it just felt really big, and that was on purpose. So oftentimes when I see a Western, I do actually like to have like a packaged little story, and you get that feeling. This film is supposed to be bigger than that. Yeah. That's fine. As far as it being just like a simple, nice, watchable Western, it wasn't really that.
No, it's not that. Thomas?
Yeah, I agree. I give it a 7 out of 10 as well. Part of the reason is the story is just beginning. It's not, I mean, this is the first chapter of
a second one comes out August 16th.
Right.
And then there's going to be 2 more at some date.
Yeah, I think he's currently working on filming the third chapter.
That's what he said in the interview.
Similarly, I think that when you think of great Westerns and Western sagas, I mean, the number one I would think is Lonesome Dove. And Lonesome Dove, if you've ever seen that one, that's a tough one to top. And in one sense, he's going up against that. And I don't know if you can beat that.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah. It is interesting. The thing is, his characters are interesting. Can I feel like I really, really liked one of them, or really, really connected with them, or have an emotional kind of, like if somebody knocks off another, oh, it'd be too bad. Or is it one that this character really grabs me and I don't want to see them die or something like that? I can't answer that yet. I feel like we've been introduced to him, to your point, but it's such a broad kind of canvas he's working on.
This is very much chapter 1.
Yeah. Right. And so
that's worth, expressing.
Yeah. Right. So from that point, I still feel kind of like I'm not fully invested in all the characters yet.
I think I liked it more than y'all, apparently, and I'm not a stickler for the historical stuff. And certainly, I think if you're within a decade, I'm like, that's good enough for me, anyhow. I'm gonna say 8 out of 10. I thought you said it was slow. I know what you mean. It is kind of deliberate.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't actually say it's slow. I felt entertained the whole time. I never got bored.
Agreed.
And it's a 2 hour and 51 minute movie. So that's well done if you can do that. If you can keep people from getting bored across that long. Sometimes one of the plot lines would get kind of dull, but then they'd swap to the next one. And, there's some good action sequences. There's obviously gorgeous landscapes. I thought the acting was good. The characters you said maybe there's none that super grab you. I will say I want to see more of Junior Sykes. Yeah. I thought he was very interesting. I'd like to see more of him. He's going to be more of an antagonist, if not an outright villain. But I'm excited to see him more. Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was fun. And again, 2 hours and 51 minutes. You're fighting not to bore people, and I was not bored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll agree. The pacing was really good. Mm-hmm. I will criticize, though, getting confused as to timing, or where are we in the plot history? Maybe that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I felt the same way.
Because there were moments when it's like, okay, did this just happen a day before, or are we now 2 weeks from that moment in time? That is where I would get lost a little bit.
There was only one scene where I noticed that, but I felt the same way. There's one scene where Kevin Costner's character is talking about going down into this town or settlement, I guess. It's not even really a town. And then the next scene we see of that plot line is the prostitute he's been traveling with turning a trick. And it's like, what happened in between there? I don't know where we are. And then, she goes out into the town and you're like, okay, they're in the same place. Not much has happened. It's just been a couple days. But yeah, I agree that for a few minutes there, I was like, what's happening here?
I wonder that almost makes me wonder if they chopped something out for length of time editing.
It did feel that way to me.
It was just, that was the most jolting of that kind of gap.
Yeah. But overall, I would say this is a movie to go see if you like Westerns. Again, there's a little bit of nudity. It's nothing gauche, but, my perfect amount of nudity in a movie would be 0. So, yeah, I think it's a good movie. I think we would all recommend it.
Yeah.
I would recommend it. Contrary to pretty much every critic.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually read many of the critics on this one. I don't know what their big criticism is.
Yeah, I haven't read the criticism.
Part of me wonders, knowing so many critics tend to be woke, the lack of a real, clear, specific, progressive message. I wonder if that hasn't got it kind of knocked a little bit, because it doesn't go and say Manifest Destiny is terrible. I mean, you're not getting that message from this movie. And so it just lets the story happen, and it doesn't try to give you too much of like a messaging, I guess is
there's no sermon in this movie.
Right. And so there is a message, but it's not a messaging that is, I would argue, offensive by any means, whereas some of them, the woke stuff definitely is. Yeah,
the messaging is more, this is reality, or at least the reality in 1863, and you have to face reality.
Yeah.
That's if there's a message, I'd say that's the message.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's our episode on Horizon, an American Saga, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is in August. We'll probably go see that one too. And we hope you liked it. This has been the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast. We're brought to you by The Patriot Post, which is the oldest conservative news digest on the web. It's right and it's free. You should be sure to like and subscribe both to The Patriot Post and to us here at the Pop Culture Contrarian. And hey, tell your friends about us. Bye.
Bye.
See you guys.